All right, I don't know what time it is on your clock, but I know what I'm getting ready for. It is time for the Professional CISO Podcast with David Mallico.
Welcome, one and all, to the Professional CISO Podcast. I'm your host, David Mallico. This show is an exploration of the topics necessary to professionalize the role of the CISO. All right, gang, we are here again. This is Innovation Series. So you're here to listen to the tech stuff. You're here to listen to value props. You're here to listen to, I'm going deep dives on different aspects of different technology that's out there today. So in this case, what we have Armis. And we've already had one with them. So we did the Armis Centrix. Now we're going to do Armis Centrix Viper. So if y'all remember, not too long ago, there was an acquisition. Armis went and acquired Silk Security. Well, today I have Or Priel. He is the co-founder of Silk Security, which is now part of Armis, as we know. And well, welcome, Or, number one. Good to have you on the show. How are you today?
It's great. It's great to be here.
Awesome. All right. So I'd love to start because, you know, regardless of technology, right? It's a human story. So tell us a little bit about Or, right? So what's your background? You know, why should we listen to you? Not in a bad way, but like, you know, establish your credibility for us, will you?
Yeah, of course. So I started my career like many others in the cybersecurity field in the IDF in Israel. Spent 8 years in the IDF in various different roles, mostly related to the world of cybersecurity. And then I ventured out into my first startup, which was a company called Cyvera. I was one of the first employees there. This was the first acquisition that actually Palo Alto made. So we were the first group to actually create the advanced endpoint security functionality that today is known as Cortex XDR. So started off there, spent 3 years with them, then another 6 years running that product line in Palo Alto Networks, of course. Then ventured off into the cloud security space in another startup that recently got bought by Tenable, which is now the Tenable Cloud Security. So I ran product for them for about 2 years before joining forces with my two co-founders here at Silk to start the Silk product and the Silk product lines, and officially was the CPO of Silk Security. That's sort of my background.
Love it. Okay, so obviously we've established now you've had a lot of product experience, right? So you've seen, and it's not just in this one specific area. You've had multiple different cloud endpoint. Now we're talking vulnerability and prioritization, right? So
Yep.
From that aspect, do you have one that you like better than the other, just from a personal perspective? And nothing against the current one if it's not the current one.
No, I'll start off by saying I like them all. They were all really, really interesting problems that we wanted to tackle at the time we started. And I think that's what mainly drives me. It's being one of the first to go into a specific field, and trying to innovate and actually bring in products that could help. Specifically here, I think is the first time where I think we're actually contributing back to the organization to the scale that I didn't feel both with the cloud security and the endpoint market, just because we're really tackling a problem that is very across the board. It's not specific to one domain within cybersecurity. So I think I'm enjoying this the most because it's also just the most that you can kind of expand and go into every field. I had to learn about AppSec. I had to learn about really what it means to manage identities and everything around it with Silk. So it was probably the most interesting and the most fun that I've had.
That makes sense, and I that's a great answer, by the way. I like that, you know, you're looking for that leverage, right? You're looking to make sure that I have the most effect on the widest area possible, which sounds like that's what you guys are doing. So good stuff. All right, so let's talk about the problem space. I want to go kind of this, let's think of it as like macro to micro, right? We're going to kind of zoom out a little bit. Let's not talk about the product yet. Let's not talk about, you know, exactly how you do things. Let's talk about what is the problem space. Let's define that for the listener so they can get a really good aspect. And that can be our foundation, and then we can drive through with everything else. So what does our problem space look like?
So the way that we view it today, or the way that we viewed it when we started the company, and I think it's still true today, is organizations keep buying more and more security tools to find really what's bad, but it's not moving the needle to a state where the organization is necessarily more secure because then they still run into challenges on how do I remediate all these security findings that are coming from the plethora of tools that I have installed in my organization. Um, to give more of a real world example, how this triggered in our mind was we were having conversations with customers coming from our previous background, right? When we were in cloud security, for example, and we saw that a team really told us like it's awesome you're finding all this bad stuff, but then they showed us the process that they have to run just for the cloud security tool within their organization to actually get the devs and engineers to remediate the issues that we found with the tool. And it was basically a whole other problem, and they like it's great we found the issues, but they're not getting fixed, so we're not moving the needle into a more secure organization as a result of it. And that was really sort of what triggered us into starting this, into getting this, that problem of like, okay, let's not focus on how do we find more problems, let's focus on helping the organization actually operationalize security, right? Get to a point where even if you don't have a process, you're running around with Excel spreadsheets, we can help you actually go down the path of more proactively starting to fix the things that your tools are finding.
So, from a problem space perspective, is this a case of I go from the point of finding that vulnerability, and then I want to obviously get to the end where it's patched or where it's configured correctly. You're trying to cut the mess out of the middle of this, right? You're trying to streamline that, make it more effective, make it less friction. Would that be accurate?
I think it's very accurate. One of the things that we found very early on that a lot of the problem is more of a people-oriented problem. It's not necessarily technology. You look at a lot of the tools, they already know how to open a ticket in Jira and ServiceNow. So getting the ticket to the location where that person looks at it is easy. That's not a challenge today. But how do I work with my counterparts? How do I measure their success? How do I show them areas that they need to improve? All that was part of the metrics that we understood that were just very, very problematic, that friction that you talked about for that organization.
And so if we talk scope on this, right? And I think I know the answer, but I want to obviously give you a chance to chime in on it. So from your earlier answer, which is you guys cover so much, what's the scope on this? Is this everything? Are we talking IT, OT, dev? I mean, is it you can think it this is the part of this problem space?
The short answer is yes, which is completely counterintuitive to when you start a startup. Usually they tell you to focus in and hone in on a specific space and go in very, very deep. We did the exact opposite. We went very, very wide and then started deepening into the areas where we saw we had the most traction. But we cover, to your point, OT, network, the classic vulnerability management space, cloud security, application security. It really is supposed to encompass everything. The only thing that we haven't done, and this was by design, is we try not to deal with the worlds of SOC because they usually have a much more defined process, but everything else is fair game.
Gotcha. All right. And then so let's talk a little bit again from a problem space perspective. And I'm obviously having a hard time saying that phrase. I probably need to stop. But a problem space, talk to me about the thought process around the Armis acquisition of Silk, right? So if we're thinking problem space, how do these things, what was the thought process? Complementary? How do they come together? What was everybody thinking when that acquisition took place from a problem space perspective?
Absolutely. So we knew that this would be very, very complementary. Where Centrix is really, really strong, or the core of the platform where it started, is really in the discovery of assets and the ability to sort of see your entire attack surface from end to end, right? And that wasn't really a focus. It was a byproduct of what we created at Silk, but it was never a focus of ours. So we knew that if we had a good foundation, we actually understood what exists in there. We had a lot of data around the different assets in the organization coming in from a strong tool. I don't want to lump it in the chasm space specifically, but we knew that if we had something that was very, very good there, it just elevates our ability to help that organization even further because we're talking about assets that are easily identifiable. We can go send them back to the exact asset that's having the issue in the exact location, in the exact site that it's happening with a lot more confidence. So it was very, very complementary, and it just made a lot of sense to us. The other aspect of this is Armis still produces findings, and they ran into the same issue that all the other companies are running into, right? Where organizations are using them, but they were constantly complaining to them about like how do we operationalize this? How do we turn this into something that just sort of works out of the box, and we don't have to keep running after the different individuals in the organization to fix all the issues that you're finding?
Right. Yeah, and I'll point everyone back to Innovation Series 1, which is where we had Michael Freeman on from Armis, and we talked about Centrix, and he touched a little bit on what you guys are doing, and I told him to also hold off to allow you or to come on and give his deep dive. But if you're looking to hear that aspect of things on the other side with Armis, Centrix, see Innovation Series 1. All right, well, now let's get into the fun part, right? So you get to talk about your product now. I'm holding you out. I was holding you out of the space, but now we're here. So talk to me specifically, like, let's do some nuts and bolts here, right? Let's get nerdy. How does your product solve that problem space that you just defined?
Absolutely. So what we started, as I mentioned earlier, is we went very, very wide. The idea is to integrate via API into all the different tools that already exist within the customer environment, whether it be their application scanners, their cloud security, their vulnerability management tools, and be able to actually pull out all the data from those different tools. The thing that we also did along the line was we understood that we had to have a good grasp of what the environment looks like. So we also built integrations into the cloud infrastructure directly. We built integrations into their build systems, into their code repositories. So we can pull as much data as possible from the environment, really understand what's going on there. Once we do all that, we actually did something that was very, very unique. And the first step that we did after we ingested all this data set was did a process that we called normalization. Now, where a lot of the tools in the market talk about this, and what they do is they just format it all into a single structure, we actually understood that a lot of the issue is the way that we communicate out with the additional individuals that have to go and remediate, because in most times it's not the security people that actually do the remediation, it's IT, it's engineering, it's somebody else in the organization that's actually responsible for the applying that patch or changing that line of code. What we did was actually convert it to talk more in their language. We're very, very concise. We tell them, you need to do this specific action in order to fix the issue, and then we'll show them the issues that will get resolved as they do that action. So we actually call it converting everything to a fix, right? So the language we talk with is actually fixes. If you apply this patch, you're going to solve these CVEs. If you make this configuration change, you're going to be locking these parts of your environment down further, so you're going to adhere to the best practices of whatever compliance standard you're looking at. So that normalization process actually gave us a huge advantage, because all of a sudden we weren't dealing with single individual events that were coming in from every single vendor. We could actually start consolidating and grouping them together based off of that fix, right? If I do this, you're going to solve X issues, as I mentioned. And then from there, we went into actually running a deduplication process across that entire data set. So as you know, in your vast experience, right, tools kept expanding the functionality that they give, right? Cloud security kept expanding what it could do outside of CSPM, then moved to the CNAPP space, right, and so on and so on. But the idea was they kept expanding and they started overlapping one another. So organizations were getting a lot of events that were just duplicates of one another. So the dedupe took care of that. From there, we went back to all that additional data that we took from the environment and understood that, okay, one of the struggles that organizations have is how do they actually prioritize across different tools, right? Every tool is competing for your attention. It's telling you, I'm the most important thing. This is the thing you have to take care of first because it's critical, and so on and so on. So what we did was create a prioritization mechanism across the board that uses the additional data that we took from the environment to understand what are your most important assets, right? Is this asset that has a critical finding actually critical for you and your organization, or can we deprioritize it because we now have understanding that it's some QA environment that's sitting somewhere and you don't care really if it gets popped or not? So the prioritization mechanism took care of really trying to understand how do we show you a unified priority across your entire tool stack. Then on top of that, we went and pulled in threat intelligence to kind of understand what's happening. We did very, very standard actions, and this is where Michael Freeman's product also comes in and that collaboration that we have with the rest of Armis, right, and added the ATI functionality to even give you that advanced early warning capabilities on top of that data set, tell you, okay, this is going to be the next Log4j. You might want to take care of this now before it becomes public, right? And we saw that recently with like the regression SSH vulnerability that came out. Mm-hmm. Where we could all of a sudden pop those up and prioritize those for the organizations that were running the product. Then the next steps over really are all about how do we make sense of that data? And if there's grouping, there's mechanisms in there to kind of show you what the biggest ticket items are, the most critical ticket items are in your organization, and how you can sort of get the biggest bang for your buck. And then the last problem was actually something that we didn't want to tackle because we knew this was very much in the space of like the CMDBs and so on, which is everything around the ownership aspect. But every organization that we entered, we understood that they have a big problem of actually identifying who the owner is of that fix. So again, we went back to that data set that we pulled and did some fancy actions like looking at your GitHub commits to tell you who the last person was to commit code to a specific branch after a tool, your AppSec scanner, scanned that repo and found that there is an issue with it. So sort of doing an automated blame process, but we do that across the board, whether it be looking at your cloud and looking at the logs, the CloudTrail logs, for example, in AWS, or whether it be looking at your endpoints and actually telling you who's mostly logged in, right? Who we think the actual user is on that device. All the way back to still connecting to your CMDB and being able to pull that data to enrich our data set. Then the last step of this process was really where I think we sort of hit the nail on the head, as they say. And what we found out was, as I mentioned early, that a lot of tools open a Jira ticket, they open a ServiceNow ticket. But part of the process that was missing, and we dubbed it the last mile, was actually taking care of that ticket through its entire life cycle, right? So we entered organizations where they had concept of orphan tickets, right? Tickets that were opened at some point by their tools, and the issue might have resolved, but the ticket is still sitting there and it's counting against their statistics badly and so on and so on. So what the system actually does is it takes care of it. It actually completely monitors it. So if the tool no longer reports the issue, we'll close it, right? Or if there's the flip situation where the issue is still being reported, but the engineer went and closed it, which happens quite often, we'll go reopen, we'll remind them, we'll escalate if needed. We'll do that entire process for them so the security team doesn't actually have to sit and be the bad guy. We wanted to remove them completely from that process. So they're sort of the escalation point, right? The system does everything automated end to end and allows you to become a lot more across the board as opposed to having to run around and notify people on what they need to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge piece right there. Is don't want to be the bad guy. To me, that's huge because that can happen really, really quick. You want to enable security, right? You want to be able to help encourage and not necessarily be the nanny, so to speak. I want to double click real quick on the prioritization. As a CISO, do I have the ability to affect how that prioritization happens? Can I kind of move the levers on that a little bit to make it reflect, what I see or how I see my risk being in my world?
Absolutely. That was one of the things that we saw from, I'm going to call it the previous generations of tools that were in this space. One of the biggest complaints that we got was a lot of them were black boxes. I didn't know how they work. I don't know how they do their prioritization. I can't impact it. So we did this mechanism which allows you to actually go and define it. To give more concrete examples, right? We have an organization that onboarded not long ago, and they got to a point where their tenable prioritization, right, their VPR score, is so well liked in the organization that they wanted to trust that purely when it comes to tenable findings. And they have that option, right? They can come and tell us, hey, don't prioritize these, keep it true to what it is, and then go prioritize everything else. So it's completely tweakable and tunable, but it's also very user-friendly. Like we see organizations constantly playing around with this as a result.
Armis is excited to be a sustaining partner at Black Hat 2024. Join them at booth number 1820 to discuss the newest trends in cybersecurity with their experts and experience the power of Armis Centrix, the cyber exposure management platform. Visit www.armis.com/black-hat for more details.
A little bit more on how we're solving the problem. Obviously, we're doing it right now. Talk to me about how your product is extensible into the future, right? Things change, where it's rapid. We're seeing this all the time. How are you guys working toward the future and making sure you stay relevant?
So a lot of the focus right now is around the integration with the company and making sure that we have with Armis and making sure that the products work well together and everything is there. But what we're looking at from the future perspective is to keep expanding. A lot of the requests that we have are less around the specific features of the product, but they're more tool integrations to make sure that we could support. I got a request yesterday for mobile security for the first time, right? An MDM solution. So going into additional fields to really, really cover areas that are so problematic for the organization. So that's one big item. The other big items are really, really making sure that we can keep delivering better functionality across each one of those sections that we do, right? So expanding the ownership functionality. We recently released on the prioritization side an ability to actually do root cause analysis. So it's expanding on that, right? Telling you that we saw in your cloud instance this issue, but we managed to trace it back all the way to your code repository and to the specific file there that actually generates that cloud instance, and we think you can fix it there, right? So trying to move the needle left where we can, as an example. So that's a big item for us. But it's really, really still focused on that process. A big part of it is still around the people. We're creating more and more gamifications for the process, which we see are getting more and more adopted, where CISOs can actually recognize their security champions, the people in the other parts of the organization that are actually contributing, spending their time fixing things, right? And recognize those. So those are some of the main areas where I think right now there's a lot to do. One of the things that we want to make sure is we look at things not for a year out. We try to do it very close term, hence our development cycle is very quick as a result of that.
And have that true reaction to the market and what the demands are. It makes sense. I like that. All right, so let's talk through kind of the people process technology, right? So we'll start with people. Me as CISO, I want to bring this tool on board. I want to use it. Sounds great. You got me convinced. What's my lift, right? What are my people going to experience? Do I need to bring more people on board? What does that look like?
So I don't think you need to bring more people on board. We haven't seen that as a situation. We've actually seen situations sort of on the flip side where we've saved people time and effort around processes that they used to run. So the lift from the people perspective is fairly low. The hardest part of the platform really is getting those integrations in place. We go to a security organization and tell them that you need to connect to your GitHub repository, and a lot of times they're not necessarily admins and they have to go to somebody else to connect to it, and so on and so on. So we see that usually security organizations start off with the tools that they own, and then slowly they start expanding as we go through the proof of concept, or once they've actually gone through procurement, they'll add more and more tools, and that's a constant. But the lift itself is fairly simple. It's again, I'm going to call it an agentless approach. We don't install agents anywhere. It's all API driven. We do all the fetching. You don't have to sit there and define what this field maps to in our data model, right? It's all just works out of the box for you, which was a lot of what we focused on in the early days. We wanted people to be able to plug and play and just start seeing the data. And then on top of that, we started building a lot of the functionality that I mentioned.
And so what are you seeing as, let's say, a barrier or a level necessary of training to get people proficient in Viper, Armis, Centrix, Viper? How do we get folks, what does that look like? All right, am I online and kind of operating within minutes, hours, it takes a couple of days? How do you guys support that?
I'll answer this in two sections. To get the tool up and running itself, once you have the integrations in place, takes anywhere between 24 to 48 hours for us to be able to pull all that data. Once we have that data, it's sort of a maturity process that we go through with the organization. Usually the team that starts managing the product goes in day one and kind of runs their operation as if the tool didn't exist, right? They sort of treat us as a very, very smart Excel spreadsheet where they can manage and see everything and start divvying out tickets. And then slowly, I would say usually within a week, they start realizing that they can use some of the more advanced functionality, like our remediation campaigns functionality, the automated ownership assignment, things like that are part of the system. And then they start turning them on, and then the process starts getting more and more automated. Usually by the end of the first month, we have it semi-automated, I'd call it, right? Some of the processes where they have a lot more confidence, like the standard patch management world, becomes almost fully automated because we can integrate into tools like Tanium, as an example, and actually trigger the fixes directly from there. So as they start trusting us more and their processes, Like they understand that they can actually run a much more complex process with the tool. We just hit a different maturity level, and then it keeps growing and growing. It gets to the point where some of the organizations that are running us have been running us for over a year now. They've actually killed their entire backlog. They have no open, no lows sitting in their environment anymore. They only deal with net new stuff that comes in because it's almost all automated at this point.
Interesting. Okay. So let's talk process. So are you guys bringing best practices to the table, and you're helping as you ramp these? You know, we like you just talked about bringing that tool in the maturity level. What's that level that Armis and Viper are doing to get that level of maturity up? How much are you helping? What's that timeline look like? What can I expect?
So absolutely. So we help. Yes, we bring in processes, but one of the things that we did by design was not force our process on anybody, right? If an organization already has a process, and they want to keep running that process, and that's what they're comfortable with, we let them run it through the tool. It's very agile in that manner. We'll highlight automatically areas for them where we think that they could do better, right? Where we think that they could, how about instead of doing this one-off, you open a remediation campaign? And a lot of it is just intuitive tooltips that happen through the product itself. And then on top of that, a lot of it is just our customer success team coming back in and telling the organization, hey, I think that if you do X, you'll see these improvements happen, right? And then in addition to that, a lot of the pain that existed for customers was just data visibility, I'm going to call it, which is ultimately solved by the tool because it's all consolidated into a single area. So they don't have to chase and run after reports, right? They don't have to go to their vulnerability scanner, cloud security, and app scanner to get a good view of what the vulnerabilities are across all the ecosystem. They come to one location, just generate a report very quickly through the tool, and it just transformed. Like we see this, we had a picture sent by one of our customers where in their company all hands, the CISO went and presented a report that was fully generated by the platform, right? Everything was just data from the platform. So we try not to force again, but there is a lot of recommendations that sort of naturally occur, and we see people going more and more after them because they know that whatever they're doing right now usually isn't working to their full extent.
Right. And as far as this customer engagement process, obviously the sale happens, you come in, we're starting. Am I having to rely on professional services as a separate part of that, or is this included in the deal, or is it just vary depending upon how it's purchased?
There's different tiers, so you do get some out of the box, and then there's additional tiers where you can go and buy professional services and so on. But it just depends on what your organization really needs. Like we have organizations that took nothing but the basic, and we have organizations that took hours of professional service just because they wanted somebody to sit over their shoulder and make sure that they're doing everything in the right way.
So you have everything available relative to what the need is of the customer, right? You're not forcing
Yes.
it upon anybody. Got it. All right. So let's talk technology for a minute. Are there any other technologies that are necessary to fully implement this, other than obviously connecting into the APIs of the tools and things like that? But is this something that runs on a VM? Is this a cloud instance? Like, what's the technical aspects of this, or all the above?
So the tool itself is a full SaaS solution. So we deliver everything from the cloud. The only caveat to that is part of what we needed to do was we needed the ability to actually integrate into on-prem tools because some of these tools still run on-prem, and organizations didn't want to open up their firewall to allow us to poke in and grab the data. So we have a what we call a broker, but it's basically a reverse proxy, which is a Docker image in this case, that we deploy within the organization that just tunnels out to us and creates the connection. So that's the only caveat for supporting on-prem tools. But for organizations that are fully in cloud, they won't even have to do that. And a lot of the tools today are cloud, so it doesn't happen very often.
Right. Okay. And so, with the swath that you guys take, are there cybersecurity tools that you replace? And you don't have to name names, but maybe categories. Is there a consolidation play here? Do I have a means am I investing here that I can save some money there?
So yes, there is a category that we replace, which is the old, I'm going to call it the old RBVM market. that existed. So if you're using tools from that market, then those could be fully replaced by the solution. The other category that was actually really interesting that came to us from some of the CISOs was part of the metrics that we can show, or we show now in the product as a request of CISOs, was your tool overlap. How much overlap you have between your endpoint protection solution that might be doing vulnerability management, like finding vulnerabilities, right? And your vulnerability scanner that's already running in your environment. And a lot of times we found sort of savings in that aspect, right? Showing them that, hey, you have so much overlap. Like one organization, they had about 96% overlap between the two sets of tools. And the 4% overlap was literally just on their IP phone environment. So the CISO actually dropped a license for the vulnerability module within the endpoint protection solution that they've had, saved a few $100,000 just by doing that. And then he got budget back all of a sudden because he found out that there's absolutely no reason to have the two tools together.
Great.
So that was sort of an added bonus of the visibility across all your tool sets.
Right. And finally, are there any complementary tools that maybe make your tool more effective that you guys find that you work well together, or that, not necessarily critical in the path, but maybe it's a superpower? You team these two things up and now you're getting some really interesting things coming out of it. Anything like that?
So I feel like I'm obligated to say Centrix, of course, as the first one.
Good call.
But,
Good call.
Other than that, not really. It just really depends. We've seen a lot of success with organizations that have automated patching processes. So they're using like a Tanium, a BigFix, a SCCM, stuff like that, where we could just work with that tool directly to apply the patches as opposed to having to go to the third party. But that's I would say, very organization specific, because some organizations don't want full automation in that area.
Right.
So it just depends. But there's no real tool that I can point at and say, like, if you have this, will be X times better. I think that what we've found through this process is that some tools are way better than other tools at giving you information that's actually useful, as opposed to just blanket noise. Unfortunately, a lot of the tools that we're working with get measured on how many issues do they find, right? And not necessarily the how well they find the issues, right? Like if they find the good stuff,
Right.
sort of.
And I think the challenge there too is, well, let's talk about outcomes, right? You can find a whole bunch of issues, but if you can't do anything about them, holy smokes, you're not doing a whole lot of good, right? So what do the outcomes look like as well? Well, Or Priel, I appreciate your time today, number one, and great information. That deep dive, I learned a lot. I think the audience is going to learn a lot as well. Of course, Armis, Centrix, Viper, formerly Silk Security. But again, thank you so much for your time today, and we appreciate any last words.
No, thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right, gang. Colleagues and friends, I renew the call. It's time to professionalize the role of the CISO. In the meantime, I wish you health, happiness, and success on your journey in becoming the professional CISO. Let's do this.
We're professionalizing the CISO role, so please subscribe to the Professional CISO podcast.